Let's go to Mr. Land, the land of magic. Come on and see Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 27, Mr. Grumpy.
It really is a pantomime.
It was a lovely summer evening. Mr. Grumpy was at home, Cross Patch Cottage. He sat down in an armchair and picked up a book. And then, do you know what he did? He tore all the pages out of it. Every one! Mr. Grumpy can't stand books. He has a shocking bad temper. In fact, he's quite the most bad-tempered person you can imagine. Grumpy by name and even more grumpy by nature. The following morning, he was out in his garden pulling out flowers. He couldn't stand pretty flowers growing in the garden. When out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure. It was Mr. Happy. "Good morning," said Mr. Happy. "Good?" said Mr. Grumpy. "What's good about it?" "But," said Mr. Happy. "But nothing," went on Mr. Grumpy. "Get out of my garden." "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Happy. "You heard me," snapped Mr. Grumpy. "Go away." "I say," laughed Mr. Happy, "you're a bad-tempered fellow." "Humph," grunted Mr. Grumpy. "And," went on Mr. Happy, "bad-tempered fellows need to change their ways." "Rubbish," retorted Mr. Grumpy, and went into his cottage, deliberately stepping on Mr. Happy's foot as he passed him. "Ouch!" said Mr. Happy. Bang! Went the door of Cross Patch Cottage as Mr. Grumpy slammed it behind him. Mr. Happy stood there, looking not quite as happy as he normally does. His foot hurt. He fought, and fought, and fought some more. Then he had an idea. He smiled and went to see Mr. Tickle. Mr. Happy told Mr. Tickle of his idea of how to get Mr. Grumpy to change his ways. And Mr. Tickle grinned the sort of grin that goes from ear to ear. That is, if you have ears, which he doesn't. "Oh!" he grinned, rubbing the hands at the end of those extraordinary long arms of his together. "That sounds fun!" That afternoon, Mr. Grumpy went to town, shopping. He walked into Mr. Meat's shop. Mr. Meat was a butcher. "Give me some sausages!" snapped Mr. Grumpy. "And be quick about it!" Poor Mr. Meat, who was frightened of Mr. Grumpy, did as he was told. But as he was doing as he was told, something appeared through his shop doorway. Do you know what it was? It was an extraordinary long arm belonging to... Well, you can guess who it belonged to, can't you? That extraordinary long arm of Mr. Tickle's came in through the door, and across the shop, and up to Mr. Grumpy, and tickled him. "Ah!" squeaked Mr. Grumpy in alarm, dropping his sausages and looking around to see what had happened. But could he see anything? He could not. "Pfft!" grunted Mr. Grumpy, and picked up his sausages and went next door, to the cake shop. Crash went the door of the shop. "Give me a cake!" snapped Mr. Grumpy, "and hurry up!" Poor Mrs. Fairy, who sold cakes, was frightened of Mr. Grumpy, so did as she was told. But as she was doing as she was told, guess what happened? "Oh!" squeaked Mr. Grumpy, dropping his cake and his sausages. He just could not understand what was happening. And the same thing happened at Mr. Daly's, the newspaper shop, and Mrs. Humbug's, the sweet shop, and at Mr. Bottle's dairy, and at Mr. Packet's, the grocer's. It went on all afternoon. And all afternoon, Mr. Grumpy kept being tickled, and dropping his shopping, and picking it up, and being tickled, and dropping his shopping, and picking it up, and being tickled, and dropping his shopping, and... he just could not understand it. On his way home to Cross Patch Cottage, he met Mr. Happy again. "Hello," grinned Mr. Happy. "Having a nice day?" "Get out of my way," snapped Mr. Grumpy, "before I kick you!" But almost before the words had passed his lips, that extraordinary long arm of Mr. Tickle's had appeared from behind a tree and tickled him yet again. He jumped in the air and dropped all his shopping yet again and fell over. Mr. Happy looked at Mr. Grumpy lying amid a jumble of sausages and cake and newspapers and sweets and milk and cornflakes. I think, he laughed, that if you were to change your ways and be not quite so bad-tempered quite so often, this sort of thing might not happen to you quite so often. Grunted Mr. Grumpy. He picked up all his shopping yet again and went home to Crossbatch Cottage. But on his way, he did think about what Mr. Happy had said, because he very definitely did not like what had happened to him that afternoon. Mr. Happy and Mr. Tickle laughed and shook hands. And so, after that, Mr. Grumpy did try to be not quite so bad-tempered quite so often. And the more he tried, the less he found he was tickled. And so, he tried more and more. And these days, he's quite a changed person. Why, only the other evening, he picked up a book, and you know what? He only tore out one page.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 28, Mr. Clumsy.
It really is a pantomime.
It was a rather nice morning. In the sky, the sun was up, shining. In the trees, the birds were up, singing. But in a rather scruffy house in the middle of a field, somebody wasn't up. Can you guess who that somebody might be? His alarm clock went off. Mr. Clumsy woke up and reached out an arm to switch off his alarm clock and knocked it onto the floor. "Whoops," he said. "That's the third alarm clock I've broken this week." Mr. Clumsy, as you might have guessed, was a rather clumsy fellow. He got out of bed and switched on the radio. The knob came off on his hand. "Whoops," he said. "That's the second radio I've broken this month." He stumbled down the stairs. The postman had been, and there was a letter waiting for Mr. Clumsy, waiting on his doormat. He picked it up and went into his kitchen. "First things first," he said, and took a slice of bread out of his bread bin and popped it into his toaster. "Now," he thought, "I wonder who this letter is from." He looked at the letter in his hand, but the letter wasn't in his hand. What was in his hand was a slice of bread. "I don't understand it," he said. "Where's the letter gone?" Can you guess where the letter had gone? That's right. He put the letter in the toaster instead of the bread. And there it was, browning nicely. "Whoops," he said, fishing it out. "Ouch," he said, dropping it. "It's hot." Mr. Clumsy bent down to pick the letter up, but in doing so, he banged his forehead on his kitchen table, and in doing so, he fell forwards and got his head stuck in the bread bin. All of which wasn't surprising, really. As we said, he was a rather clumsy fellow. In fact, he was a very clumsy fellow. Actually, he was the clumsiest person in the world. That very same morning, after he managed to get the bread bin off his head, Mr. Clumsy went to town, shopping. "First things first," he said, and went into the bank to get some money. And somehow, while he was in the bank, Mr. Clumsy, while he was writing a cheque, managed to spill ink all over the bank manager. "Whoops!" He went into the butcher's. "Morning, butcher," he said cheerfully. And then he somehow managed to trip over his shoelaces, and somehow managed to fall into the butcher's shop window, and somehow managed to finish up with a string of sausages round his neck. "Whoops!" he said. Mr. Clumsy's next call was the supermarket. Just inside the door, there was a huge pyramid pile of cans of soup. Well, you can imagine what happened, can't you? Exclaimed Mr. Clumsy. "Soup will be nice for supper." And he picked up a can. Not a can from the top of the pile. Oh no, not Mr. Clumsy. "Whoops!" said Mr. Clumsy, and went on his way, rubbing his head. On his way home, he called in at the farm for some eggs, and somehow, while he was crossing the farmyard, he managed to trip up. And somehow, as he was falling, he managed to grab hold of the farmer. And somehow, they both managed to finish up in the duck pond. Splash! "Whoops!" said Mr. Clumsy. "Please," said the farmer, as they sat together in the duck pond. "In future, can I deliver your eggs to you?" "That's extraordinarily kind of you," replied Mr. Grumpy. Don't mention it, muttered the farmer. Mr. Clumsy went home. First things first, he said, and went for a bath. But as he was stepping into his bath, his foot somehow managed to slip on the soap, and he somehow managed to turn a somersault, and he somehow managed to land with his head in the linen basket. "Whoop!" said a muffled voice. Later, he went downstairs for supper. Soup from the supermarket, sausages from the butcher's, and eggs from the farm. Or rather, soup from the saucepan that had boiled over, sausages from the frying pan that had caught fire, and eggs, oh dear, very, very, very scrambled eggs. A normal Mr. Clumsy sort of supper. That was nice, he said, leaning back in his chair. Crash! Whoops, said Mr. Clumsy. I think I'd better go to bed. And he did. And that is the end of the story. Good night, Mr. Clumsy. Mr. Clumsy leaned over to turn off his bedside light and... oh dear. Whoops!
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 29, Mr. Quiet.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Quiet liked the quiet life. He lived quietly in a small little cottage in the middle of a wood. The problem was that small little cottage was in the middle of a wood in the middle of a country called Loudland. Everything and everybody in Loudland was noisy. Oh, the noise! Dogs didn't go woof like dogs you know. They went, take a deep breath, woof! People didn't shut their doors like you and I would shut our doors. They slammed them. Bang! People didn't talk to each other. They shouted at each other. Hello! They'd shout as they meet in the street. And you've heard about something being as quiet as a mouse, haven't you? Not in Loudland. They had the noisiest mice in the world. Squeak! Squeak! They roared at each other. Mr. Noisy would have liked living in Loudland. He'd have loved it. But Mr. Quiet didn't. Noise frightened him. So he stayed in his cottage in the middle of his wood as much as he could. But of course, he couldn't stay there all the time. Every week, for instance, he had to go shopping. He used to creep into the butcher's shop. Good morning! Bellowed the grocer. What can I do for you? Please, whispered Mr. Quiet. Can I have some cornflakes, please? What? Cornflakes, please, he whispered. Speak up! Mr. Quiet tried his loudest whisper. Cornflakes. Can't hear you! Shouted the grocer. Next, please! And poor Mr. Quiet had to creep away without any cornflakes. That wasn't fair, was it? He creeped into the butcher's. Please, he whispered. I'd like some meat. The butcher couldn't even hear him. He was humming to himself, loudly and fiercely. Mr. Quiet tried again. Please, he whispered. I'd like some meat. The butcher started to whistle. It sounded more like a burglar alarm than a whistle. Mr. Quiet fled, empty-handed. It often happened, which probably explains why he was so little. Poor Mr. Quiet. He sat at home that night with a feeling of despair. Whatever am I to do? He thought. It's no use, he thought. I'll just have to try again. And so, the following day, he went shopping again. But the same thing happened. Can't hear you! Thundered the grocer. Next, please! Can't hear you! Bellowed the greengrocer. Next, please! Can't hear you! Roared the milkman. Next, please! Can't hear you! Boomed the butcher. Next, please! Oh, dear. Poor Mr. Quiet went home and went to bed, hungry. The next morning, he was awakened by a noise which sounded like bombs dropping. It was the Loudman postman knocking at Mr. Quiet's door. Bang! 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 Mr. Quiet went and opened the door. Morning! Shouted the postman. Letter for you! Mr. Quiet took the letter into his kitchen. He sat down to open it. He waited until the noise of the postman's footsteps died away. Mr. Quiet opened the letter in great excitement. He never had a letter before. It was from Mr. Happy in Happyland. An invitation to stay. Mr. Quiet was overjoyed. He rushed upstairs and packed his bag and set off that very morning. It was late when he arrived on Mr. Happy's doorstep. He knocked on Mr. Happy's door. Tap, tap, tap. Mr. Happy opened the door. "Hello," he smiled. "I thought I heard something. You must be Mr. Quiet. Well, don't just stand there. Come in and have some supper." It was the first proper meal Mr. Quiet had had for months. And while he was eating it, he told Mr. Happy all about his problems he'd been having in Loudland. Mr. Happy was most sympathetic. Over breakfast the following morning, Mr. Happy told Mr. Quiet that he had been thinking about his problem. "I think," he said, "that under the circumstances, you'd better stay here in Happyland." Mr. Quiet's face lit up. "And," continued Mr. Happy, "we'll find you a house, and," he went on, "a job." Mr. Quiet's face dropped. "I'm not very good at jobs," he confessed, "because I'm so quiet." "Ah," smiled Mr. Happy, "I have the very job for a quiet chap like you." And so, the very next day, Mr. Quiet started work. And he loves it. Do you know where he works? In the Happy Lending Library. As you know, everybody who goes into a library has to be very quiet, and only whispering is allowed. What a clever idea of Mr. Happy's, wasn't it? And these days, Mr. Quiet is as happy as can be. Why, only the other day, do you know what he did on his way home from work? He was so happy, he laughed out loud. Can you imagine?
Next, please!
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 30, Mr. Rush.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Rush was the fastest thing on two legs. He used to rush hither and hither, and back again all the time. And of course, he was always in such a rush that he never ever finished anything properly. One morning, he woke up with a jump. He'd only had time for 3 hours sleep because he had been rushing about for so long the day before. "Oh dear!" he cried, leaping out of bed. "I'm late!" And he rushed into his bathroom and washed, not very well as he was in such a hurry, and cleaned one tooth and rushed downstairs, 3 at a time. Mr. Rush had a boiled egg and toast and a cup of tea for breakfast. He boiled the egg for 5 seconds and it tasted awful. He toasted the bread for 1 second and so it wasn't brown at all. And, as he couldn't bear to wait for the kettle to boil, he made his tea with cold water. Ugh! What a horrid breakfast! And of course, he was in such a rush, he only ate half of it. Rush, rush, rush. Silly fellow! After his half of breakfast, he rushed off again. Out of his front door, leaving it open, down his garden path, out of his garden gate, leaving it open too, and off down the lane. He passed Mr. Happy. "Hello," called Mr. Happy. "Good morning, Mr. Rush. Where are you off to?" "Can't stop," cried Mr. Rush. "I'm in much too much of a hurry." I can see that, thought Mr. Happy to himself as he watched Mr. Rush disappear into the distance. I wonder where he's going. Where Mr. Rush was going was nowhere. Fast, as usual. Mr. Rush rushed around all morning, and then rushed home and had a quick bite to eat, a sandwich without bread, and then rushed off again, and rushed around all afternoon. That evening, he was reading a magazine. He never had time to read a book, when he saw an advertisement for a holiday. "Oh," he said, "I'd like that. Haven't had a holiday for ages." But then his face fell. "I can't go on holiday," he thought, "because I don't have any money." And then he thought again, and his face rose. "I know," he thought, "I'll get a job." And so, the following morning, he rushed off and got a job with a farmer milking cows. But of course, he wasn't any good at that because if there's one thing a cow can't stand, it's being rushed. especially when she's being milked. So Mr. Rush rushed off and got himself another job, driving a bus. But of course, he wasn't any good at that because he was always in such a rush he never stopped at any of the bus stops. And if there's one thing people waiting on a bus stop don't like, it's when the bus doesn't stop for them. So Mr. Rush rushed off and got himself another job as a waiter in a hotel. But of course he wasn't any good at that because no sooner had he served people a meal and they'd taken one bite than he whisked the plate away from under their noses. And if there's one thing hungry people can't stand, it's having food whisked away from them. Poor Mr. Rush. No job, no money. Oh dear, he sighed to himself. I'm never going to be able to go on holiday. He looked very glum and gloomy. But then an idea struck him. An idea for a job for someone who rushes around all the time. An ideal job for someone who was the fastest thing on two legs. Do you want to know what that job was? Would you like to know what that job was? Postman! Delivering express letters. Mr. Rush was so good at it, he delivered twice as many letters in half the time any postman had ever done it before. Soon, he had saved enough money for that holiday of his. And so, the very next week, there was Mr. Rush, sitting on a beach in the hot sunshine under a palm tree on holiday. This is the life, he grinned, and rushed off for a swim. His 15th that day, and then it was breakfast time.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 31, Mr. Tall.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Tall was very, very, very tall. Quite the tallest person you've ever met. In fact, quite the tallest person you've never met because you've never met anybody with legs as long as Mr. Tall's legs, have you? Now, the problem of being as tall as Mr. Tall was that life was just one long problem, as you can see. Oh dear, he used to sigh. Oh dear me. I do so wish that my legs weren't quite so very, very, very long. He decided to go for a walk to think over his problem. He was just stepping over a tree when he heard a voice. A little voice. Hello! It was Mr. Small, standing underneath a daisy. But Mr. Tall was so tall he couldn't see him. So Mr. Small shouted at the top of his voice. Hello! And Mr. Small's shout is about as loud as a bee's sneeze. So it took quite some time for Mr. Tall to spot him. Oh, he said gloomily. It's you. You don't look very happy, said Mr. Small. What's up? I'm not, replied Mr. Tall, because of these silly long legs of mine. Oh, said Mr. Small. Mr. Small decided to cheer him up. Let's go for a walk together, he suggested. So they did, which, of course, didn't work. It was like a giraffe going for a walk with a mouse. Then Mr. Small had an idea, which did work. And because of the length of Mr. Tall's legs, they very quickly walked all the way to the seaside. Come for a swim, cried Mr. Small. Can't, replied Mr. Tall. By the time it gets deep enough for me to swim, I'll be out the other side. So Mr. Small went for a swim, while Mr. Tall sat down with a face which was nearly as long as his legs. Mr. Tickle came along. Hello, he said. You look as if you need cheering up. Care for a tickle? No thanks, replied Mr. Tall. What I would care for are some different legs. Mine are much too long. So are my arms, said Mr. Tickle cheerfully, but all the better for tickling. And off he went, chuckling, looking for somebody to tickle. Looking for anybody to tickle. Mr. Nosy came along. Chill up, he said. You look very down in the mouth. What's the problem? It's my legs, replied Mr. Tall. They're too long. So's my nose, replied Mr. Nosy, laughing. But all the better for poking into other people's business. And off he went, looking for something to be nosy about. Looking for anything to be nosy about. Mr. Greedy came along. Hello, he cried. You look gloomy. What's wrong? It's my legs, explained Mr. Tall. They're too big. So is my tummy, replied Mr. Greedy, but all the better for filling with food. And off he went, licking his lips. Mr. Tall sat there and thought about Mr. Tickle's arms, and Mr. Nosy's nose, and Mr. Greedy's tummy. He smiled, and then he grinned, and then he laughed out loud. He looked at his legs, those very, very, very long legs of his. All the better for walking, he chuckled, and walked home in 4 minutes, 40 miles. Mr. Small came out of the sea after his short swim. And how am I going to get home? He asked himself. So he set off walking all the way home, 40 miles. That was last year. He got home yesterday.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 32, Mr. Worry.
It really is a pantomime.
Poor Mr. Worry. Whatever happened, he worried about it. If it rained, he worried that his roof was going to leak. If it didn't rain, he worried that all the plants in his garden were going to die. If he set off shopping, he worried that the shops would be shut when he got there. And when the shops weren't shut when he got there, he worried that he was spending too much money shopping. And when he got home with his shopping, he worried that he left something behind, or that something had fallen out of his basket on the way home. And when he got home and discovered that he hadn't left anything behind, and that nothing had fallen out of his basket on the way home, he worried that he bought too much. And then he worried about where to put it all. Life was just one long worry for poor Mr. Worry. One day he went for a walk. He was worried that he might walk too far and not be able to get home. But on the other hand, he was worried that if he didn't walk far enough, he wouldn't get enough exercise. He hurried along worrying. Or you could say, he worried along hurrying. He met Mr. Bump. I'm very worried about you, he said. Why's that? Asked Mr. Bump. I'm worried that one of these days you might hurt yourself, he said. Don't you worry your head about that, replied Mr. Bump, and went off, tripping over his own feet. Mr. Worry went on. He met Mr. Noisy. I'm very worried about you, he said. Why is that? Asked Mr. Noisy. I'm worried that you might lose your voice, said Mr. Worry. Don't you worry your head about that, said Mr. Noisy, and went off. Clump, clump, clump. Mr. Worry went on. He met Mr. Greedy. I'm very worried about you, he said. Why's that? Asked Mr. Greedy. I'm worried that you might eat too much and be sick, explained Mr. Worry. Me? Replied Mr. Greedy. Eat too much? Impossible. And went off for lunch. Mr. Worry went on. He met a wizard. Hello, said the wizard. Who are you? I'm Mr. Worry. And you look it, commented the wizard. Tell you what, he went on, as he was a helpful sort of a wizard. Why don't you go home and write down every single thing that you're worried about, and I'll make sure that none of these things ever happens. He smiled. And then you won't have anything to worry about, will you? Mr. Worry smiled. It was the first time he'd smiled for a long time. In fact, it was the first time he'd smiled that year. He hurried home in great excitement. When he got home, he sat down to write out all the things that worried him. Every single thing. It was a long list. And then he went to bed and had the best night's sleep he had in years. The following morning, the wizard came round to collect Mr. Worry's list. My goodness me, he said when he saw the size of it. However, he said, leave it to me. I'll go off and make sure that none of these things ever happens. And off he went. Nothing to worry about now, he called over his shoulder. Nothing at all. Mr. Worry heaved a sigh of relief. That day was the first day in Mr. Worry's life that he didn't have a single thing to worry about. And the next day, and the day after, and the day after that, On Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, Mr. Worry didn't have a care in the world. But on Monday morning, he was a worried man. Oh dear. What do you think was worrying him? Can you guess? He went to see the wizard. Oh dear, said the wizard when he saw him standing on his doorstep. What's worrying you? I'll tell you, said Mr. Worry. I'm worried because I don't have anything to worry about. And he went home to worry about not having anything to worry about.